Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, joined by a very old friend and a very important influence on my life and career, Dr. Kurt Campbell. As I am sure every listener will know, Kurt served most recently as Deputy Secretary of State. Before that, the senior coordinator for the Indo-Pacific in the White House under President Biden. I first met Kurt when he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia. In the Clinton administration, he served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary for East Asia. So he's led every Asia post and senior diplomatic post you could imagine in government, and started the Center for New American Security, the consultancy, the Asia Group, key parts of CSIS, a real giant figure in American Asia strategy, known to many, and a real thrill to have him here in Australia to talk about the region. Welcome, Kurt.
Mike, it's a thrill to be here. I'm really pleased to be on your podcast today.
So you've had such a renaissance and interesting life. We can't spend the whole podcast on all the things you've done, but your trajectory to Asia maybe was a little unexpected. I know you grew up in California. Your PhD was on sort of Cold War era South Africa and so forth. And then Joe and I pulled you over to work on Asia. Had you given a lot of thought to the region before, or was that a pretty sudden introduction and the rest is history? Any seeds planted before Joe and I put you on the Asia job?
Well, Mike, I did have an opportunity when I was in the Navy. I had a short stint at Yokosuka in advance of a ship visit to Vladivostok back during the dying days of the Cold War, and so was on that base for about 2 or 3 weeks. This was at a moment where Japan was at its zenith, and basically the American dollar bought almost nothing in Japan, and so we rarely ventured off the base because everything was so expensive. But I became interested in Japan at that moment. I was asked, as you indicated, by Professor Nye. By the way, he's very much missed. He passed earlier this year. 2 giants in Asia strategy and my own life, familiar also to Mike, Joe Nye and Rich Armitage, both passed, who are huge supporters of our alliance engagements in the Indo-Pacific. Joe and I asked me to come over to the Pentagon and to work on the Indo-Pacific. At that point, we talked about it in terms of East Asia. I would say that my lack of knowledge was absolutely clear. And one of the people that went out of their way to help me understand and kind of think about the nuances and the hidden ironies of Asian policy was Mike Green. And as I recall, even to this day, the trips that we went on together, every single time you helped me understand something deep about Japanese history, about how they thought about the world. Hardly a week goes by that doesn't cause me to reflect on that. And so I have benefited from the patience and support of many people. At that time, that was almost now, it's almost 31 years ago. I was very much a novice, and I still think of myself sometimes in those ways. But frankly, it was people like you that helped me feel a little bit more comfortable in the strategic environs of the complexities of East Asia.
I remember very vividly meeting you for the first time in Joe Nye's office in the Pentagon. You were working on a policy planning unit in the Pentagon, and Joe wanted you to take over the Asia account because it was so important to him, and Japan was so important to him. And what he knew, of course, was that you were incredibly effective at government in the White House, Treasury, and then the Pentagon. And I had almost no government experience at that time. Most people thought foolishly written a dissertation, a PhD on alliances in the 1990s when the Cold War was over. And I was sort of not sure what I was going to do next. And Joe connected us, and the incredibly important work you and Joe did with support from Rich Armitage on the Nye Initiative. The whole thrust of that was to get alliances back at the center of American foreign policy after the Cold War and as the North Star for American strategy in Asia. And there was a lot of resistance, wasn't there, in the 90s?
Yeah.
And even every administration, really, there's been something of a debate. That debate sort of diminished by Biden, it's back, but about how important allies are. How would you reflect on that sort of strategic contestation that you participated in for 30 years?
So, Mike, you discussed this drama that plays out in your excellent book by More Than Providence. But the truth is that for most of the last 30 or 40 years, the dominant school of thought among the small group of people that do work in the Indo-Pacific was that at the very center, at the zenith of policy, was U.S.-China relations, and that we had to devote ourselves to that diplomacy, and the idea of sitting in the big stuffed chairs talking about the French Revolution with Chinese counterparts was at the absolute height of what you would seek or want to do in foreign policy. And that was the dominant group in both administrations, backed up by the titans of industry and finance. And it was generally thought of as in keeping with the most important strategic initiative of the 20th century, which is the opening to China. In fact, there was an incredibly small group of people, largely with military experience and some academics, that believed that the better way to undertake policy in Asia was to focus not in out, i.e. get China quote, quote, right, and then focus on other countries, but instead to focus on allies and partners. And then through those partnerships, you're better able to deal with a rising China. In truth, that first school that focused on China tended to look down on alliance politics. They would deny that, but I think we both felt it undeniably. And it was a pretty hard slog for some period. I think Mike and I are both grateful to people like Rich and Jonai and others who really labor to try to make the strategic argument. I would say that by the time President Biden had come along, this had gone from being a very small school to by far and away the dominant school, embraced in a bipartisan fashion at the highest levels. The truth is that I think that wisdom is now being challenged by elements of the Trump administration, but it is not really about placing China at the center of strategy. It is whether foreign pursuits are aligned with American interests any longer. And so, Mike, I am confident relatively that at a strategic level, there's quite a lot of bipartisan commitment to this idea of working closely with allies and partners. And frankly, I have been the beneficiary of that. When I went for confirmation late in the Biden administration, I had a lot of questions about whether that was even going to be possible. I got overriding support from Republicans, which is unusual, frankly, in politics today, to be able to say that this is something that unites parties. But I believe there is a consensus that working together with allies and partners is the best way to promote not just American values, but the operating system of the Indo-Pacific that we helped construct over decades.
You can see it in the polls when you were assistant secretary, 2011-12 timeframe, I think it was, 9, 10, 11, somewhere in there. First Obama administration, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs asked the American public in a survey, is our future in Asia with China or is it with Japan and traditional allies? And a narrow plurality said allies, very narrow plurality in 2012. By 2017-18, it was 80% or more in polls, including ones we did at CSA, said our future's with our allies. So the country caught up to you. And when the Biden administration came into office, there were questions in Japan, there were questions in India about whether this might be an administration that equivocates on allies, that looks for a grand bargain with China. I think putting you in charge in the White House was an early indication. No, this is going to be not a overly confrontational administration with China, but one that focuses on allies as our critical edge. You did a lot. The Biden administration did in 6 months what most administrations do in 4 years in terms of building up the Quad, the trilaterals with Japan and Korea, the Squad on the Philippines, I mean, just the IP4 with NATO. I'm going to ask you for a minute to reflect, and I'll ask you what didn't go well in a second. But what, from your 4 years, do you think is the most important piece of national security architecture that you and Jake Sullivan and Eli Ratner and Tony and others were able to put in place for the future?
Well, Mike, first of all, thank you for the kind words. Almost everything in government is possible if you're prepared to work with others, share credit, and not be a dick, frankly. And I tried to exemplify that.
I don't think we have to bleep that part, so we'll keep going.
All right. Maybe another word you put it in. Okay. How about say being unpleasant? All right.
Yeah, we'll go with the original.
All right. So I would say at a general level, I think we were able to put in some component pieces of strategy that our hope will be durable. I think of all those things, AUKUS is important. The effort to get Japan and South Korea to work more constructively together in a trilateral context, the links between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, like the United States, those are all extraordinarily important. But I think of all of them, I think the Quad, the lifting of the effort that you first helped scope, Mike, back when you were a senior director in the White House, when the Quad was first formed in the wake of the tragic tsunami that struck Indonesia and Southeast Asia. That was an important strategic stroke for a variety of reasons. There had been less focus on it in recent years. The Trump team elevated some of that at a foreign ministry level. We took it to the leader level, and the level of ambition grew on almost a regular basis. I think that piece of architecture, even though it is considered to be unofficial or nascent, behind the scenes became deeply consequential. At the outset, the country that was most ambivalent, India, over time became the leading country in the Quad, the one that was most committed to its success and to its growth into once were thought as no-go areas like security, like infrastructure and the like. And so my hope is more than anything else that the Quad continues and that the recent breach between the United States and India can be healed, because I think it is so important for the maritime democracies to be able to operate together.
Yeah, the breach with India seems personal at the top and political, but the structure of the relationship over the longer term has a lot of depth, I think.
I hope that's right. I have been told that a group in the Indian elite that is skeptical and wary of the United States has gained traction in recent weeks, given the downward trend in U.S.-India relations. And I note that many of my counterparts and interlocutors who have supported the U.S.-India relationship are, frankly, a bit on their heels and feeling under some pressure. My hope is that we'll be able to reverse what you describe as kind of personal understandings and animus and get us back on a strategic trajectory that, it, frankly, serves the interests of both countries and the regions at large.
A lot of international relations can be boiled down to agency structure and contingency.
Yeah.
Agencies, a lot of it is about leaders. That's not going well at all. That's the rupture. Structure, I think, is on the side of U.S.-India relations. Maybe contingency is too. I think when you were in office, some of the big momentum in India's interest in the Quad resulted from things the PLA did to India.
Yes.
And that's contingency. And if I were betting money, I'd say the PLA will do something to India again.
Yeah. The truth, Mike, is what you laid out in terms of the things that we were able to accomplish. A huge factor in being able to weave some of these initiatives together was the provocative nature of Chinese foreign policy. The decades that when we worked together over a substantial period of time, I think it would be fair to say that Chinese diplomacy was often deft, sophisticated. For a few years during the Wolf Warrior period, President Xi and his team overstepped, took initiatives that were deeply concerning to almost all the countries that border China, and frankly provided us a bit of an open door to be able to take advantage of some of those Chinese missteps. For instance, what you talk about with India, the China's brutal moves over the line of actual control in 2020 and then thereafter, work in the South China Sea and the Senkakus that frankly created larger concerns, even among countries that tended to want to be more sympathetic towards China. And we were able to utilize some of that anxiety towards building coalitions and consensus towards policies that back the sustainment of this operating system that we're describing in the Indo-Pacific. More recently, I'm afraid that it has been some of the steps on the part of the United States, however, that has allowed China to regain its footing in, frankly, the propaganda wars, arguing that it is the United States that is the provocative country, the bully country that is undermining peace and stability in Asia. And the Chinese have recaptured some of their momentum as a result. I'm not sure that is fully understood in the Trump administration, but as I travel in the region, there are undeniable signs of a erosion in public support for the United States during this very difficult period.
You and I have agreed on almost everything in Asia strategy. The one area where we've probably had the most maybe tactical disagreements over the last 3 decades has been the role of democracy values in American foreign policy strategy. And as you know, I take the view, it's not Wilsonian, it's practical. We need good governance. We need accountable governments. We need a free press. We need to support NGOs to shine a light on elite capture corruption, obstacles to us having access militarily or economically. Your comment just now sounds like you're worried about that, but how do you think about that sort of ideological, informational values battle with China? You think we're losing right now in the region?
I don't know, Mike, it's hard when we look at these sweeping geostrategic trends. Sometimes it's hard to have a scorecard on a daily basis. And this month we're ahead, this month we're behind, like that. I would simply say that I didn't actually feel that was the area that we had debates. I do believe that values and democracy has to be central to American purpose. But I think probably where I am most comfortable is approaching those issues with a degree of humility. And oftentimes when you're sitting in Asian seats of power, you feel like Americans browbeat and come in and dictate and lecture. I think now, given some of the things that we are experiencing in our own country, the key has got to be when we do summits of democracy and the like, that the idea that we get to choose who comes, who doesn't come.
Yeah.
I think we have to realize that democracy is something where we can learn from other countries, that we have much to learn ourselves, that we have weaknesses that we are experiencing, and that these are initiatives in which we have to be careful not to appear that we believe that we are somehow superior to other countries. I will tell you, I travel to a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific whose democracies are healthier than our own, Mike. And I think we have to recognize that and realize it and then proceed to learn from others. I think what China is doing is not so much around democracy or human rights or the rule of law. They're making an argument about the United States as a disruptive actor, that the steps that they're taking with respect to tariffs and the like are affecting the bottom line. And I think that has been quite an effective storyline in Chinese leading edge efforts at, United Front propaganda efforts. And I think those can be dealt with, but I would simply say that when we talk about American purpose, I think the most important thing for the United States is to understand that working collectively with aligned states is additive to American power, not as an anchor that inhibits our ability to be effective.
No, I am with you on that. And if you're referring in your earlier comments about who gets to come and who doesn't get to come to the summit on democracy for democracy,
I don't know.
I'm with you on that one. I was raised a Unitarian Universalist. There are many paths to God. And if Thailand's democracy is flawed or Singapore's is not ours, you bring everyone to the table who's interested in that journey, in that comparing of experiences. We do a thing at the Study Center with the NED and CSIS called the Sunnylands Initiative, the whole point of which is to be humble about the American experience and get voices from the region talking about their experiences and paths.
But I would simply say, though, Mike, like the National Endowment of Democracy, the IRI, these institutions, like we may have quibbled a little bit around the edges. I think overall their programming and their work has been additive to American strategic purposes. And the fact that these organizations have been basically dramatically constrained in terms of resourcing by the Trump administration. That's something that we both can agree on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just taking an arrow out of our quiver and throwing it in the bushes to no purpose. I want to get back to your experience because I was dying to ask you earlier. I think you'll know the answer. You mentioned the Quad is one of the most important things. What was the hardest? I don't think it was a Quad. Was it AUKUS? Was it opening an embassy in the Solomon Islands? I mean, what was the hardest thing you had to do? Just give people listening a sense of, because government is hard. And I think you told me, compared to your experience with Obama and Clinton, it was even harder. More dense, more contestation. Yeah. But what was the hardest?
I mean, you constantly wonder, Mike. I often think about the stuff that we did together. I mean, it's possible that we were both younger and you just feel differently about the world. And so it could be you don't want to become one of those guys that says, oh, back when I was young. Yeah, you don't want to do that. But government is hard. And remember, when the Biden administration began, imagine a situation where we had to wear masks everywhere we went. I was tested every single day. It was a pretty challenging kind of just the operating environment was difficult. Government for me, is about trying to get things done. And so I've always tried to be ambitious with initiatives. The AUKUS initiative was challenging. It began when a mutual friend of ours came to me at the beginning of the administration, Andrew Scheer, with a message from the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Morrison, about the idea of basically a joint endeavor on developing a nuclear-powered submarine. The last time we had made such a decision to cooperate with another state on developing that technology was in the 1950s with Great Britain. We'd said no to many other countries that had sought to go in the direction with us. And the Australians were asking again. And we, after intense internal diplomacy, months of enormous three-way engagements in which the United States, Great Britain, and Australia, we met near the Pentagon. We had 60 guys on each side, like 180, 200 people negotiating the details of what a submarine deal would look like. I would say it utilized every skill that I had developed: persuasion, diplomacy, ability to try to master technical things. And I remember the day it was launched, it caught people by surprise, and it was a pretty big deal. Because we didn't have an opportunity to really explain much in advance, we had to really quickly turn around and try to explain. The Chinese, I think, immediately tried to sell it to skeptical countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific as nuclear proliferation. We had to work on that. But the most difficult thing was the hurt feelings in France. And we thought we had a game plan that had basically took into consideration every element of what could go wrong. And I'm not going to rehash it here, but frankly, the effort to talk quietly to the French did not happen effectively. Probably falls more on the Australian side, but we are where we are. But when AUKUS was launched, to much fanfare the next day, President Macron went out and was extremely critical of President Biden in personal terms. And it upset President Biden enormously. So I remember I went from one day being, wow, this is a big deal, to the next literally being in the doghouse. And for 3 months, the White House is unique, Mike, is when you take a misstep, somehow everyone knows. And so no one wants to sit next to you at the lunch table and stuff. And I weathered that. I knew what it was going to be like, and it happened. It was hard. And we offered France the first state dinner, and we had to do a lot to rebuild that relationship. At the same time, I don't think we got much for it. France, in many respects, either carefully undermined or was contrary to our efforts in the Indo-Pacific and NATO and elsewhere. Just a very challenging country to work with more generally. But those are hard things when you take a major risks and kind of advance what you think is important, and then there's a perception of it being perhaps mishandled in the rollout. Now, subsequently, it has regained its luster and its stature. But, Mike, government is about If you take risks, if you seek to launch initiatives, you can face setbacks. I was very proud of the work that I did negotiating the release of Aung San Suu Kyi to launch Burma on its path to democracy.
That was in the
Obama administration. And to see what's happened subsequently has been heartbreaking. Yep. Negotiated with the Chinese around efforts that they were taking and initiatives against the Philippines and the like. That diplomacy was very troubling, very hard. So government is not always about victories. Sometimes you have setbacks and you have to accept those. And those are a good part of life. I will say, I hope that the people who worked with me saw that on the days that we were successful, I was careful to give others credit and not kind of puff chest out, but understood that was an important day. So not get too high in those days that maybe things didn't go as well. Approach the job with the same sense of determination.
You taught at the Kennedy School.
Yeah.
And something I learned from you and from Joe is if you're an academic, you claim credit and you get rewarded for claiming credit for ideas. I mean, it's the whole point. In government, you claim credit, your idea won't become policy. And it's amazing how many people fail to learn that lesson.
Yeah.
It's funny, when I worked in the Bush administration in the White House, you knew when you were in trouble because people shunned you. I knew I was in good standing because people I didn't know that well would come up and slap me on the back and start talking to me, and they all had Texas accents.
Yeah.
How'd you know when you were in good standing in the Biden White House?
I was often the one that would talk in meetings to the president, and sometimes when there had to be messages that were challenging to be delivered, I would be asked to be the one to do it. I saw that as a sign of confidence, but probably also a sign that I was expendable as well. Look, the most important thing I could give those who are listening, who are contemplating a career in government or to serve in these high stakes arenas, is to recognize that you are going to have challenging days and that you really have to have a steady demeanor and that you have to sort of take it as that it's going to be hard going forward without question. I will say that, and sometimes the things that can be difficult are hard for people to even understand. So I'll give you one example, Mike. At the beginning of the Biden administration, the decision taken by some of the doctors and other folks was the president would not break bread, would not have meals, and there would be no food served when leaders came to visit. Well, Mike, you know a lot about Asia and Asian hospitality. If you invite a friend, a senior friend over to visit and there is no food, it's seen as kind of an insult almost. It's not appropriate. And I remember during the first meeting, and we were lucky to be able to argue that if the president was going to send a signal of the importance of the Indo-Pacific, let's start with Japan. And Mike, that's your legacy, the work that you had done. I will also say that when it came time to decide how we should describe our strategy, we adopted and continued to use the Indo-Pacific moniker. One of the people that was most persuasive in arguing why we should continue this Abe construct, the framework of how to think about the Indo-Pacific sort of handed down by Prime Minister Abe, was you, Mike, arguing that this was a important signal to Japan and the like. And there were a lot of people in government that did not want to do that. But we agreed that was the direction that we would go. And I fought for that against many people who thought.
And they didn't like it. For people who don't know, the Trump administration came in without a real clear framework for Asia policy. And Rex Tillerson gave a speech at CSIS after his policy planning team met with the Japanese side. And they told him about the free and open Indo-Pacific. And it became the structure for the speech and the framework for the Trump administration's policy.
Exactly.
And so people in the White House were saying, well, that's Trump.
Exactly.
No, it's not. It's Japan.
Not. And I also pointed out that, look, if we wanted to be successful in the Indo-Pacific, we should be bipartisan and we should make clear that some of what we are doing is a continuation of what President Trump had done. Now, that was deeply unpopular, but frankly, was also followed. We did it. When Prime Minister Suga, who was the first visitor to the White House, came, after unbelievable difficult back and forth, we finally agreed that there would be food. And so I have a picture on my desk, which I always look at, and it's President Biden and Prime Minister Suga sitting opposite each other, about 20 feet apart at a table in which they're each sitting with masks on with a giant hamburger in front of them. And so we agreed that there would be food on the table, but both leaders remained masked during most of the meeting. So that's some of the
small victories.
Yeah, small victories and a sort of, but yeah, those things can be challenging, trying to convey how something will be perceived in another country. But all told, I found the experience, I very much enjoyed working with Jake Sullivan. I had great support from people on the outside like you. And frankly, I was thrilled the bipartisan commitment to working in the Indo-Pacific was clear.
It is, I think most people in the business agree, one of the most bipartisan issue sets in Washington, generally speaking. We'll get to it in a minute, but there's some ruptures now. But generally speaking, in the Congress, among think tanks, with the business community, it's pretty strong consensus. I wanted to ask, you led the transition team for state, and I saw Jake Sullivan said in an interview with Peter Harcher at the Sydney Morning Herald, an exit interview, that the thing he thought should be picked up by the next administration that he wished he'd done is something on critical minerals with allies. And now he may have just been saying it because it's an Australian outlet, who knows, but if you can tell us, what was your message to the incoming administration? Obviously continue the Quad and the alliances, but what unfinished business, or put another way, if Harris had won, what unfinished business would you have picked up immediately?
Great. So look, the things that, Mike, that I learned, and you do learn a lot in government, the element that is essential now in the formulation and execution of strategy at the highest plane is technology, and recognizing it used to be that throwaways and understanding elements of sort of the arcane nuclear calculus between the United States and the Soviet Union was the necessary features of understanding of global power. Increasingly understanding the dynamics of AI and 5G, quantum, synthetic biology, robotics, those are the essential features of national power now. And it's only relatively recently, Mike, that the United States at the strategic level understands the importance of having a strategy for these critical technologies. And I think that was one of the points that I made to my interlocutors. I think some of that was heard, but the Trump team has decided to lift some of the restrictions that we placed on certain capabilities on China. I question that strategic logic. But the other element, frankly, relates. We can talk about manufacturing and how much of that in strategic areas has left the United States. That's going to take decades to rebuild. But it is also the case that the component pieces of the technology economy involve rare earths and critical minerals, of which, if you look at a listing of the 30 or 40 top component pieces of the trace elements and the like that go into technology, we are dramatically behind. The Chinese have cornered the market in all areas. One of the things that's most important in the U.S.-Australia relationship is understanding why we need to work together with Australia to help relieve some of the key vulnerabilities where China has us over a barrel.
Last question. You're teaching at Georgetown now?
Yeah.
I know you've spoken with students, but this is the first time you're actually teaching your own class since Kennedy School. So that's like 30 years, is it?
Yeah.
So the classroom is so different.
It is.
The technology, the chat GPT, all the rest of it. But also students going into international affairs, students studying Asia, students thinking about careers in the field, whether it's business, think tanks, NGOs, or government. They must be thinking at some level, there's so much disruption, the shockingly high tariffs, the rupture with India, the DOGE, the debates within the Democratic Party about Gaza. There's just so much disruption. At some level, of course, as we both know from history, there's a lot of continuity and structure and consensus, but there's just so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
What are you going to tell your students to motivate them and give them a sense of purpose and keep them focused on the right things?
Well, Mike, first of all, that has been one of the abiding asks of the senior folks at Georgetown who asked me or recruited me to come in to teach. And I want to thank you, Mike. You are in addition to the work that you do here, you're on leave from Georgetown, but Georgetown has one of the dominant schools of foreign policy in the world. And so I was asked, one of the things that you've got to constantly do is to motivate, encourage, and support students who may be questioning their decision to work in foreign policy and in government. And I must say, I have found it to be completely the opposite. They're the ones that are encouraging me. They're the ones that are motivating me. They're the ones that are giving me a sense of optimism. And so I find myself looking forward to every class. The questions are good. The students are thirsting for knowledge. They want to know more about what it means to operate. And I find that most of them are determined to continue to want to serve. I mean, one of the things that, frankly, I'm struck by with you, Mike, I do believe that you tend to not get as distracted by the choppiness on the top of the water and look more at the enduring lower strategic currents that can be more reassuring. I hear that in some of the discussions that we've had since I've been here in Sydney, and that encourages me as well. But ultimately, this next generation of students, and they are excellent at Georgetown, as they are here at the University in Sydney, are ready to take on challenges ahead. They know that there are challenges, but they are clear-eyed, both about the challenges and the opportunities. And so, no, I found it to be really very much in the opposite. They're the ones that have buoyed me. I'm not sure I've been able to encourage them, and probably it turns out I'm the one who needed the encouragement all along.
So maybe you should be paying them. But we'll save that for a discussion with Dean Joel Hillman.
I will just simply say, Mike, if you go into teaching at Georgetown thinking in some way that you're going to be rich at the end of the day, good luck with that.
Shh, don't let that out.
Okay.
So terrific. Kurt Campbell, National Treasure. Really great having you here in Australia. Always good seeing you in DC. Thanks for your service. And thanks for doing this for a next generation now as well.
Mike, thank you. And I would just tell your listeners as we speak. So last couple of days, it's been terribly rainy and chilly and floody here in Sydney. The sun is out. It's beautiful outside. And I've just had an opportunity to meet with Mike's faculty, sponsors, and students. It's great to be here. I'm encouraged and I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity to be with you today, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.